When people imagine collapse, they picture a dramatic moment when everything suddenly stops. Lights go out, alarms blare, panic fills the streets. But the truth, the uncomfortable truth most people never think about, is that real collapse almost never arrives that way. It doesn't explode into existence. It creeps. It builds. It grows in the background like pressure rising inside a sealed container, silent until the moment it finally bursts. And that's exactly what happened in the years leading up to the American Revolution. If you lived back then, you wouldn't have woken up one morning and thought, "Ah, yes, time for a revolution." Life would have felt mostly normal, with just enough discomfort to bother you, but not enough to make you think everything was falling apart. And that's the danger. Collapse is invisible until it's already underway. At first, the colonists just dealt with new taxes and rules the same way we deal with rising bills or annoying government decisions today. They complained a little, maybe argued in taverns or around dinner tables, but then they went back to their daily routines. Nothing seemed extreme. Nothing seemed like a threat to their entire way of life. The British government was far away. The soldiers weren't always visible. There was no sense of urgency. But deep underneath that calm surface, cracks were forming. The British Empire was drowning in debt. Their policies were tightening. Supplies were becoming inconsistent. The colonists were being squeezed, not by one big event, but by a long chain of small pressures that slowly made everyday life harder. And that's how collapse truly begins. Not with panic, but with frustration. Not with riots, but with tiny changes that people ignore because they hope things will just go back to normal. But they don't. They never do. Once pressure starts building, it keeps building. And for the people back then, the pressure came from every direction. Prices rose. Goods disappeared. Local trade became unstable. The government grew more distant, more demanding, less sympathetic. Every year, the gap between the people and the system that controlled them widened. And the wider the gap gets, the more fragile society becomes. Most colonists didn't think they were heading toward war. They didn't think they were living inside the early stages of a historic collapse. They just felt annoyed, uncomfortable, uncertain. But uncertainty is the first signal that something much bigger is happening. When people feel unsure about the future, when they feel the system no longer understands them, when daily life becomes slowly more difficult, that's when collapse begins. Quietly, patiently, almost politely. And here's the part that links the past to us today. If the American Revolution teaches us anything, it's that the moment to prepare, the moment to pay attention, is not when everything breaks, it's when the pressure first starts to rise. Because by the time the explosion hits, by the time the real chaos begins, it's already too late. Collapse always whispers before it roars. The colonists didn't hear the whisper. Will we? People love to think a crisis ends the moment you win. The moment the battle is over, the moment the danger passes, the moment the enemy retreats. We imagine some kind of clean finish line, where life magically snaps back to normal. But history shows something very different. Survival isn't the end. It's the beginning of the hardest chapter. And the American Revolution is one of the clearest examples of that. Everyone celebrates the victory, the independence, the birth of a new nation. But few people understand what came next. And what came next was chaos, hunger, debt, division, and a long, painful struggle to rebuild a world that had crumbled. Imagine the war is finally over. No more battles. No more armies marching through your fields. No more fear of waking up to soldiers knocking on your door. But when the smoke clears, you realize your home is burned, your crops are gone, your tools are destroyed, and your savings are worthless. The British didn't send money to help you rebuild. The new American government didn't have money either. You're free, but you're broke. You're independent, but you're starting from zero. That was the reality for most colonists. Victory didn't fill their stomachs. Freedom didn't repair their barns. The war ended, but their struggle didn't. The young United States was drowning in debt. Inflation was out of control. Veterans went unpaid for years. Farmers lost their land because they couldn't pay new taxes. Communities that had fought side by side now argued about how the new nation should be run. States didn't trust each other. Leaders disagreed on almost everything. The very people who had just won a revolution were now fighting to survive in the ruins it left behind. And here's the part most people don't realize. Some colonists even wanted another revolution, a second uprising. That's how bad things were. Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts was just one of many examples where desperate, starving people rose up again because life after the war wasn't better, it was harder. When a system collapses, rebuilding it is never clean. It's never simple. It's messy, confusing, and filled with new dangers that didn't exist before. And that's a lesson every survivalist needs to understand. In a blackout, in any long-term crisis, surviving the event is only phase one. The real test is what happens after. How do you rebuild? How do you stabilize? How do you create order in a world where everything has broken at the same time? The colonists had to reinvent their economy, their laws, their communication, their entire identity. They didn't just start a new nation, they started over as human beings. So when we talk about survival, we can't just think about the moment of crisis. We have to think about the aftermath. When the lights come back on, or when the threat fades, or when the danger passes. What kind of world will be waiting for us? The American Revolution teaches that survival never ends where you think it does. It continues into the rebuilding, the recovering, and the painful decisions required to shape a future out of broken pieces. Winning is one challenge. Rebuilding is another. And sometimes rebuilding is the hardest fight of all. When people talk about the American Revolution, they love to focus on the battles, the leaders, the strategies, the flags waving in the air. But the real truth, the truth hidden underneath all the dramatic moments, is that survival, not heroism, was at the core of everything. Ordinary people weren't thinking about glory or independence or shaping the future of a nation. They were thinking about getting through the day. They were thinking about food, warmth, safety. And that's where we see one of the biggest lessons the revolution can teach us. Survival is not about strength or perfect planning. It's about endurance. It's about scarcity. It's about improvisation when the world you depend on falls apart. Imagine living in the colonies when the war finally broke out. There was no stable economy, no unified government, no promise of supplies. Trade routes collapsed. Imports stopped. Everyday items that people assumed would always be available vanished overnight. Flour, sugar, salt, metal tools, candles, medicine, fabric, blankets. Suddenly everything became scarce. Not because people weren't working hard enough, but because war crushes supply chains. It always has, and it always will. And those who survived the revolution weren't the ones with the most resources at the beginning. They were the ones who learned how to stretch what little they had for as long as possible. Families learned to ration. They learned to repair instead of replace. They learned to make candles out of animal fat, to grind herbs into medicine, to create winter clothing from old scraps. Colonists melted down pewter plates and cups to make bullets. Farmers hid livestock in forests to keep soldiers from taking them. Blacksmiths turned farming tools into weapons. Children carried secret messages because they could move unnoticed. Every person improvised, adapted, and found some new way to survive each challenge that came. And the soldiers? They lived in even harsher conditions. The Continental Army wasn't some well-equipped force marching confidently into battle. Most of the time they were starving, freezing, or barefoot. There were times when soldiers wrapped their feet in rags because they had no shoes. Times when they marched for days on empty stomachs. Times when they slept in open fields during brutal winters with nothing but thin blankets. What kept them alive wasn't firepower or perfect training. It was endurance, the ability to push through discomfort, exhaustion, and fear because the alternative was giving up everything. And that's the part of survival people often forget. In any crisis, whether it's war, a blackout, or a breakdown of society, the people who make it through are not the strongest or the toughest. They're the ones who adapt fastest, the ones who stay calm when supplies run low, the ones who can take one small thing and stretch it for days, the ones who can keep going when their body and mind are telling them to quit. The revolution reminds us that survival is not a moment. It's not a single decision. It is a long, grinding test of patience and creativity. A test where small choices matter more than big victories. A test that proves one thing. You don't need abundance to survive. You need resilience. The kind the colonists discovered when their world collapsed, and the kind we'll all need if darkness ever falls again. If there's one thing people overlook during any crisis, it's how quickly society crumbles when communication disappears. We think danger comes from violence, from hunger, from cold. And yes, those things are real. But the fastest, most powerful destroyer of stability is silence. The kind of silence that leaves you guessing, doubting, fearing the worst, because there's no reliable voice telling you what's actually happening. And during the American Revolution, that silence wasn't just a problem. It was one of the biggest forces shaping the entire conflict. Imagine living in a world with no internet, no radio, no phones, no instant updates. The only information you get comes from letters, travelers, or local gossip. Now imagine that world during a war. Suddenly mail stops arriving. Travelers vanish or bring back rumors instead of facts. Newspapers get shut down or censored. Entire towns go days, weeks, months without hearing a single official announcement. That was daily life for colonists. They were living in a blackout long before electricity existed. People forget that the colonists had no idea how the war was going. They didn't know who won battles. They didn't know which roads were safe. They didn't know whether British troops were days away or weeks away. News traveled at the speed of a horse, and even then, it wasn't guaranteed to be true. Rumors filled the void left by silence. Whispers spread faster than facts. One traveler might say the British were burning everything in their path. Another might say the Continental Army just won a major victory. A third might claim the war was already lost. Every rumor changed how people behaved, and fear became the controlling force. Entire communities made life or death decisions based on incomplete or totally false information. Families fled their homes because they heard soldiers were coming, only to find out it was never true. Militias marched out based on rumors and walked straight into ambushes. Farmers hid their food because they heard starvation was coming, which then caused actual shortages. Silence breeds panic, and panic creates real problems. And that's the exact danger we'd face today in a long-term blackout. When communication disappears, people don't stay calm. They don't stay rational. Without trusted information, even small problems feel like threats, and real threats feel like the end of the world. You can survive without power. You can survive without money. But when you can't communicate, you lose the ability to make smart decisions. You lose the ability to coordinate with others. You lose the ability to know who you can trust. During the revolution, communities were forced to create their own networks just to stay alive. Writers carried secret notes. Families used coded signals. Neighbors whispered through door cracks at night. They built their own communication systems because the official ones had collapsed. And those who had access to information, even tiny bits of it, became leaders. Not because they were powerful, but because they could guide others through the darkness. The lesson is simple but serious. When communication breaks, society follows. The colonists lived that reality every day. And if a modern blackout ever lasts long enough, we will too. Because without information, fear becomes the loudest voice in the world. One of the most dangerous parts of any collapse isn't the enemy outside, it's the division inside. And that's exactly what happened during the American Revolution, long before the first battles. The colonies didn't split into patriots and loyalists overnight. It wasn't a clean, simple line. It was a slow, painful tearing of the social fabric, a kind of emotional civil war that started in people's homes, shops, churches, and neighborhoods. At first, everyone lived side by side without much conflict. People held different opinions, but those differences didn't threaten anyone's life. But as pressure grew, as policies tightened and fear increased, opinion turned into identity, and identity turned into danger. Imagine living on a quiet street where everyone knows everyone, and then one day, your neighbor starts looking at you differently. Not because you offended them, not because of anything personal, but because rumors are spreading, sides are forming, and everyone is being forced into a category. You either support independence or you support the crown. You're either a patriot or a loyalist. And if you try to stay out of it, both sides start wondering what you're hiding. Neutrality becomes suspicious. Imagine your friends suddenly questioning your loyalty. Imagine your own family arguing about the future of the country while you're just trying to keep food on the table. That was the emotional battleground of the revolution long before muskets fired. We often imagine history as heroic and organized, but real life isn't like that. Division doesn't show up as a flag or a uniform. It shows up as broken trust. It shows up when people stop seeing each other as neighbors and start seeing each other as threats. The patriots believed the loyalists were traitors, supporting a distant empire. The loyalists believed the patriots were dangerous radicals, destroying the peace. And the people in the middle, the ones who just wanted stability, got trapped between two rising storms. Both sides pushed. Both sides demanded loyalty. Both sides punished anyone who didn't obey. And here's where things turned dark. Families split apart. Brothers fought brothers. Communities that had been peaceful for generations suddenly became hostile overnight. People were dragged from their homes for questioning authority. Properties were burned. Businesses were boycotted. Lists were made. Lists of names. People to watch. People to silence. The social collapse happened before the political collapse. And history shows this again and again. When trust dies, society cracks. This is the warning the American Revolution leaves for us. When a nation becomes divided, when every disagreement becomes a battle line, when people start choosing sides instead of solutions, the stage is set for collapse. And during a blackout, a crisis, or any long-term emergency, those divisions become even sharper. People get desperate. People get scared. People get suspicious. And fear turns neighbors into enemies faster than hunger or cold ever could. The truth is, survival isn't just about food and water. It's about community. It's about knowing who stands with you when everything else falls apart. And the revolution shows exactly what happens when that community breaks. The question is, what side would your neighbors choose if darkness fell today?